My brother stole my inheritance by lying about my mental state, so I stole his by proving his drug addiction. The smell of old books in mahogany filled the lawyer's office as I sat across from my brother, both of us dressed in our best suits like we were attending a funeral instead of the reading of our father's will. The irony wasn't lost on me that we actually had attended Dad's funeral just 3 days earlier, and now here we were, about to discover what he'd left behind for his two sons. I remember fidgeting with my tie, the same navy blue one I'd worn to every important event since college, while my brother sat perfectly still with that smug expression he'd perfected over the years. Our father had been a successful businessman who'd built his company from nothing, working 16-hour days and missing most of our childhood events, but always making sure we knew he was doing it all for us. He'd promised both of us that we'd be taken care of when he was gone, and sitting in that leather chair, I felt confident that his word meant something. The lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat and began reading the legal jargon that seemed to drag on forever. Then came the bombshell that changed everything in an instant. According to the will, my brother would receive 75% of Dad's estate, including the family business, the house, and most of the investments. I would get 25%, but only if I could prove that I was mentally stable and capable of managing money responsibly. The lawyer explained that there was a clause stating that if I couldn't meet these requirements, my portion would automatically transfer to my brother. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room as I stared at the document in disbelief. My brother's face remained neutral, but I caught the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth that he always got when things went his way. This couldn't be right because Dad had never expressed any concerns about my mental state, and we'd had countless conversations about both of us taking over different aspects of the business together. The lawyer handed me a sealed envelope that contained a letter supposedly written by our father, explaining his reasoning for the unusual distribution. As I read Dad's words, my hands began to shake because the letter detailed incidents of erratic behavior, depression, and poor decision-making that he claimed to have witnessed in me over the past few years. According to this letter, he was worried that I might squander my inheritance or make reckless choices that would harm the family legacy. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. Half of the incidents mentioned in the letter had never happened, and the other half were grossly exaggerated versions of normal life situations. The time I'd taken a mental health day from work became a week-long absence due to psychological instability. The argument I'd had with my ex-girlfriend was transformed into a violent outburst that supposedly concerned Dad about my ability to maintain relationships. I looked across the table at my brother, who was now openly smirking, and suddenly everything clicked into place. He'd always been the golden child, the one who seemed to effortlessly excel at everything while I struggled to find my place in Dad's shadow. But I'd never imagined he would stoop to something this low, this calculated and cruel. The lawyer explained that I had 30 days to undergo a psychological evaluation and provide documentation of my mental fitness, or else my inheritance would be forfeit. As we left the office, my brother patted my shoulder with fake sympathy and told me he hoped I could get the help I needed. The condescending tone in his voice made me want to punch him right there on the sidewalk. I spent the next week in a daze, trying to process what had happened and figure out how to prove my mental stability to a system that seemed rigged against me. The psychological evaluation would cost thousands of dollars, and even if I passed, I'd still only get a fraction of what should have been mine. Meanwhile, my brother was already making plans to sell off parts of Dad's business and liquidate assets. That's when I decided to fight back, but not in the way anyone would expect. Instead of focusing on proving my own sanity, I started paying closer attention to my brother's behavior and habits. I'd always known he liked to party, but I'd never realized just how dependent he'd become on various substances to get through his daily life. It started with small observations during family gatherings over the years. He'd always been the first to suggest opening a bottle of wine, and he'd somehow managed to drink most of it while everyone else was still on their first glass. At Dad's funeral, I'd noticed him stepping outside every hour or so, claiming he needed fresh air, but always returning with slightly dilated pupils and a newfound energy that seemed artificial. I began documenting everything I could remember about his behavior patterns, from the way he'd constantly sniff and rub his nose during conversations to the fact that he'd lost a significant amount of weight over the past year despite claiming to be healthier than ever. His mood swings had become more pronounced, shifting from manic excitement to irritable anxiety within the span of minutes. The breakthrough came when I decided to visit him unannounced at his apartment one evening. I'd brought over some of Dad's old photo albums, using them as an excuse to spend time together and observe him more closely. When he answered the door, his eyes were bloodshot and his speech was slightly slurred, but he tried to play it off as being tired from work. As we sat on his couch looking through pictures, I noticed him excusing himself to the bathroom multiple times, always returning with a sudden burst of energy and talking much faster than before. The coffee table had a thin layer of white residue that he quickly wiped away when he thought I wasn't looking, and there were small plastic bags partially hidden behind books on his shelf. But the real evidence came when his phone kept buzzing with text messages from contacts, saved with obviously fake names like Pizza Tony and Cleaning Lady Sarah. The messages I caught glimpses of were clearly about scheduling deliveries and discussing prices for items that definitely weren't pizza or cleaning supplies. I realized that my brother had been living a double life for years, maintaining a professional facade while battling a serious addiction that was spiraling out of control. The irony was almost too perfect. Here he was, trying to paint me as mentally unstable while he was the one who couldn't function without chemical assistance. Over the next 2 weeks, I carefully gathered more evidence of his drug use. I followed him to meetings with dealers in parking lots, photographed him making transactions, and even managed to record a conversation where he was discussing buying larger quantities to get better prices. I felt terrible about invading his privacy, but he'd crossed a line when he manipulated Dad's will to steal my inheritance. The most damning evidence came when I discovered that he'd been using company funds to support his habit. Dad's business had a petty cash account that my brother had been systematically draining, making small withdrawals that wouldn't trigger any automatic alerts, but added up to thousands of dollars over time. He'd been covering his tracks by manipulating the bookkeeping, but I'd learned enough about the business over the years to spot the discrepancies. I also found out that he'd been selling some of Dad's personal items to support his addiction, including a vintage watch collection that was supposed to be part of the estate. He'd told everyone that Dad had given him the watches as gifts before he died, but I had pictures of them from the estate inventory that proved they should have been included in the will. Armed with this evidence, I made copies of everything and prepared to turn the tables on my brother. But instead of going to the police or the lawyer immediately, I decided to give him one last chance to do the right thing. I arranged to meet him at a coffee shop downtown, bringing along a manila envelope containing all the proof of his drug use and financial improprieties. When I showed him the photographs and documents, his face went through a range of emotions from confusion to anger to fear. He tried to deny everything at first, claiming the photos were fake or taken out of context, but the evidence was overwhelming. The financial records were particularly damning because they showed a clear pattern of theft from the company. I told him that he had 24 hours to confess to the lawyer about manipulating Dad's will and to agree to a fair redistribution of the inheritance. If he didn't, I would take all the evidence to the authorities and expose his drug addiction to everyone in our family and professional circle. The choice was his: come clean voluntarily or have his life destroyed by the truth. He begged me to reconsider, claiming that he'd been planning to get clean and that losing the inheritance would make it impossible for him to afford treatment. But I reminded him that he'd shown no such mercy when he decided to fabricate stories about my mental state to steal what rightfully belonged to me. The difference was that his problems were real and self-inflicted, while mine were entirely fictional. The next morning, I got a call from the lawyer asking me to come to his office immediately. When I arrived, my brother was already there, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He'd brought his own lawyer this time, and together they drafted a confession admitting that he'd provided false information about my mental state to influence Dad's will. The confession revealed that my brother had been struggling with addiction for years and had convinced Dad that I was the one with problems by manipulating conversations and taking things out of context. He'd preyed on Dad's fears about leaving money to someone who might waste it, all while he was the one who actually couldn't be trusted with financial responsibility. But the story took another unexpected turn when the lawyer revealed that Dad had actually left behind a second will, one that had been hidden in his safe deposit box. This will, dated just a month before his death, showed a completely different distribution of assets, 50-50 between both sons, with no mental health requirements or conditions attached. The will we'd heard the week before had been an earlier version that Dad had apparently changed his mind about. It turned out that Dad had discovered my brother's drug problem on his own and had been planning to confront him about it. The second will included a note explaining that he'd realized he'd been manipulated and wanted to ensure both of his sons were treated fairly. He'd also left specific instructions that if either son was found to be struggling with addiction, their portion of the inheritance should be placed in a trust fund that would pay for treatment and provide supervised financial support. My brother broke down completely when he realized that Dad had known about his addiction all along and had still been trying to help him rather than punish him. The guilt of manipulating our dying father's emotions while he was trying to do the right thing was finally too much for him to bear. The lawyer explained that the second will superseded the first one, which meant that my brother's confession had actually been unnecessary from a legal standpoint. However, the evidence of his drug use and theft from the company would still need to be addressed, and the trust fund provision meant that his inheritance would be managed by professionals until he could prove he'd been clean for at least 2 years. I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness as I realized that I'd gotten my inheritance back, but at the cost of destroying my relationship with my brother and exposing the extent of his problems to everyone involved. Part of me wondered if there might have been a better way to handle the situation, but he'd made his choice when he decided to lie about my mental state. The aftermath was complicated because while I'd achieved my goal of reclaiming my inheritance, I now had to deal with the reality that my brother was seriously ill and needed help. The company would need to be restructured to account for the missing funds, and someone would need to take over his responsibilities while he got treatment. I decided to use part of my inheritance to pay for a high-quality rehabilitation program for my brother, not because I forgave him for what he'd done, but because I knew Dad would have wanted me to help him get better. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now in a position to show him the same kind of mercy he'd refused to show me. The legal proceedings took several more months to resolve, during which time my brother entered treatment and began the long process of recovery. He wrote me letters from rehab, apologizing for his actions and trying to explain how his addiction had twisted his thinking and made him capable of betraying his own family. In the end, I inherited exactly what Dad had intended for me to have, but the victory felt hollow because of everything that had been lost along the way. My brother and I would never have the same relationship we'd had before, and the family business bore the scars of his financial mismanagement and theft. The experience taught me that sometimes the people closest to us are capable of the deepest betrayals, but it also showed me that the truth has a way of coming to light even when it's buried under layers of lies and manipulation. Dad's final gift to both of us wasn't just the money he left behind, but the lesson that actions have consequences and that real love sometimes requires tough choices. As I write this story, my brother has been clean for 8 months and is slowly rebuilding his life with the support of the trust fund Dad set up for him. We talk occasionally, but the easy camaraderie we once shared is gone, replaced by a careful politeness that acknowledges the damage that was done. I've learned to be more careful about who I trust with important information, and I've become much better at recognizing when someone is trying to manipulate me or take advantage of my good nature. The whole experience made me stronger and more self-reliant, even though that wasn't the outcome I would have chosen. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just accepted the original will and tried to prove my mental stability through the proper channels. Would my brother have eventually confessed on his own, or would he have continued down his destructive path until it destroyed him completely? I'll never know the answer to that question, but I'm confident that I made the right choice in fighting for what was rightfully mine. The most important lesson I learned is that family relationships are fragile things that can be damaged by greed, addiction, and betrayal, but they can also be rebuilt with time, honesty, and forgiveness. My brother and I may never be as close as we once were, but we're both better people for having gone through this experience and come out the other side with a deeper understanding of ourselves and each other.